Hi everyone, welcome to another G News podcast. Today we are joined by Deborah Russell, who is Labour's spokesperson for Revenue, Climate Change and Associate spokesperson for Finance. And Deborah is joining us today under the conditions that she's actually got quite a bad cold and a sore throat. So please bear with her because it's quite difficult to talk. Hey Deborah, welcome to G News.
Oh, thank you for inviting me to be here.
No, you're very, very welcome. I'd like to talk just about entirely about climate change in this interview. And so let's start with what the previous Labour government were doing about climate change, the laws that had been put into place by Labour and the actions that were already underway and were being taken to bring down emissions. Could you give us a summary of the many things that Labour had underway before the 2023 election?
Well, for starters, we didn't do it by ourselves. We did it with our colleagues in the Green Party. And James Shaw, working really hard actually with Todd Muller in the National Party to develop a bipartisan consensus, helped to put together the Zero Carbon Act, which set our climate goals, set our climate budgets, and then we got underway with doing some stuff that actually made a difference. So I just want a big shout out there to James and also to Todd. For it's hard building cross-party consensus, and they did it. In terms of what we were actually doing, the list is long. Is everything from the clean car discount to the climate emergency response fund to actual decarbonisation initiatives like putting in process heat at Glenbrook Steel Mill, and what else? We were funding public transport. It kind of just goes on and on and on in terms of what we were doing. Replacing coal boilers in schools, all the sorts of things that we were doing to actually get emissions down, and it was starting to work.
Yeah, but the current government, it says it's got a very, very different way to reach the same goals that it set with regard to climate. But what we're seeing is that it's ripped the guts out of the funds, and when it comes to actual emissions reduction actions, there's really bugger all happening as far as I can see. So what's your take on what they've done so far and what's happened to these three emissions reduction budgets? Well, maybe explain what they are to our audience and where they're up to, what their status is.
Okay, so if we start with what the emissions reduction budgets are, what they are is they're set by the Climate Commission and agreed by government. So the Climate Commission recommends climate budgets or emissions budgets. I don't really like that word budget, but it's what we use. It's a plan. What's our plan for getting emissions down? And they're set in 5-year blocks so that we can start planning towards them. The first emissions budget finishes soon, and actually emissions, we're going to meet that budget. We are actually getting emissions down. But in the recent climate monitoring report published by the Climate Commission, they said that our second climate budget is at risk and our third climate budget won't be achieved. So in terms of what the national government is doing to achieve climate goals, I kind of want to say not very much. They've, in fact, mostly what they've done is they've taken stuff away. So, they stopped the clean car discount. They've stopped the climate emergency response fund. They've gotten rid of the sustainable biofuels obligation. They haven't yet come up with a methane target. They're actually subsidising some large climate emitters. So there's just a whole lot of stuff that they haven't done. And what's really worrying is that the Stats New Zealand figures from the first part of this year show that in the first 3 months of this year, our emissions actually went up, not down.
Mm-hmm. So ERB1, ERB2, ERB3, what are the statuses of those? As you mentioned ERB1, we're going to meet that. What's happening with the second one and the third one?
Okay, so ERB1, I think the Climate Commission's monitoring report said that we were likely to reach it. So we are on target for it. It wasn't necessarily particularly ambitious, but it was getting us underway. ERB2 is at risk because we don't have policies for climate. and ER3B just isn't going to be achieved. I think they said unless immediate action is taken now. In other words, we actually need to get some policies in that actually reduce emissions. There's two ways we can meet our emissions goals. So our emissions goals are to have net zero carbon by 2050. That's right. And yes, that's correct. And to reduce methane by between 24 and 47% flow by 2050. To get to net zero, there's two ways you can do it. One is you can reduce your gross emissions. The other way is you can increase the carbon sink, so more planting trees. But what we've found is that we simply cannot plant enough trees to get ourselves out of trouble. We actually need to get our gross emissions down, and we're not doing that.
Yeah. So when it comes to the reality of what the scientific world is now saying and what the reports are that are coming through about the future and what they're forecasting and predictions, we're starting to hear things that are a bit more intense, like possibilities, scenarios of a 2.9 degree warming for temperature rises and sea level surges. And we're hearing some statistics around what could be the case, around 2090. With some pretty dire impacts on some houses and insurance and the future years for future generations. Could you maybe shine a light on some of that information? What's being said in the scientific community about the future?
What we know, excuse me, I'm going to have to cough for a moment.
That's all right.
What we know now is that we are likely to go past 1.5 degrees of warming. The Paris Agreement had, I suppose, really a couple of goals. One is we want to limit the world to 2 degrees of warming, but everyone was to make their best efforts to keep it to 1.5 degrees of warming. It seems we've overshot the 1.5 degrees, and it's going to be very, very hard for us to claw our way back down to it. No one is saying that we're going to reach, as far as I can tell, maybe that we'd get to 2.9 yet. We'll have to wait for the IPCC to do its next assessment of all the science. But it does seem we're going to overshoot the 1.5. And the problem is that every single little bit of warming matters. It makes the consequences worse. I think the worrying way we're seeing it, look, we get people who still don't believe in climate change. And I just say to them, well, you may not believe in climate change, but your insurer does. And we're starting to see insurance withdrawal. That means insurers not being prepared to insure private property anymore because it is too risky. Maybe it's right by sea level, maybe it's by crumbling cliffs, maybe it's going to get affected by big storms. We know that storms are getting more intense because of climate change. So all these things are starting to happen.
Yeah, I heard that was it around about 2040 they're just not going to fund houses that get wiped out by floods anymore, this kind of stuff. They're just, the whole thing is really just to not even bother helping people.
That's an interesting take on it. That's not quite what was said. So there's a couple of things going on in that space. So we, as well as thinking about how we reduce our emissions, we have to start thinking about how we adapt to a climate, to a warming world. Last year, the year before last, there was an excellent report from an expert working group on how New Zealand could adapt. And it was led by people like Jonathan Boston. Belinda Story was on there. Some really good people who had a long, hard think about what we need to do. The government, the national government, commissioned its own independent group on climate adaptation. And one of the things that group has said is that more or less the government can't continue to bail out people from property on pretty much an ad hoc basis, as we've been doing. So after Cyclone Gabrielle and after the Auckland anniversary weekend floods, we had government stepping in with a buyout for affected properties, but it was an ad hoc response. We're now saying we actually need to develop a much more considered response. And part of that might mean that over, I think that group suggested 20 years, that government would gradually withdraw its support. what that means is that people who are in climate vulnerable property may not get support anymore in another 20 years or so. In the meantime, government should be doing things like helping people to actually secure their properties. So, doing some work, say, in South Dunedin, which is very climate vulnerable, or in Westport, which is very climate vulnerable. But also, people themselves need to start thinking about their own property purchase decisions. And I think the government's kind of got a point when it says, look, if you're going to buy and develop an expensive property on the top of a crumbling cliff face, maybe that's on you, not on the government. On the other hand, what do you do for someone who bought their property, say, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, well before we understood the climate crisis, and they are now trapped in that property? No one will buy it. It's a really tricky situation.
Yeah. Okay, so when it comes to the kind of things that we hear about carbon capture from this government a lot. So what is the sales job that you think they might be spinning here versus the reality with carbon capture as you understand it? What's it all about?
So, the idea with carbon capture is developing some technological process that will remove carbon from the atmosphere. I mean, we've got some pretty good carbon capture in trees, but this is a way to try to, get carbon capture by another method. There was a project underway at Kapuni in Taranaki, developing some techniques to capture emissions and store them underground. The government had factored that into its emissions reduction plans. It was part of the way it was going to meet our emissions goals. However, Fletcher's, which was backing this project, has said that it's too expensive and they can't afford to do it. They're going to need a government subsidy for it. I've asked the Minister for Climate Change whether he intends to subsidise Fletcher's. He hasn't responded to that yet. But given that they're pinning their hopes on carbon capture, I think they're going to have to do something in that space.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I worry with the carbon capture stuff. To me, it feels like people want to be saved by the magic technology fairy.
Yeah, that's what we're hearing.
Yeah, and I'm sure that in time we will develop technology that helps, but actually we can't pin all our hopes on. We've actually got to start reducing emissions in any way we can.
Exactly. So speaking of that, agriculture and the ETS, could you talk a little bit about what actually happened there and where we are now up to when it comes to agriculture and our ETS framework?
Right. So we've, as part of our climate goals, we've said, and it's sitting in our legislation, that we need to reduce methane flow by between 24 and 47% by 2050. The problem is with methane, it's a very short-lived gas, but it has quite an intense heating effect. So because it's short-lived, what matters is not so much how much of it gets into the atmosphere and stays there, because it doesn't stay there. It's about reducing the amount of flow of methane. So that's one of the first things around agriculture, is we need to set a methane target. The government is supposed to be doing that this year. It hasn't so far. I've asked the Minister for Climate Change when it will be happening, and he hasn't. I've been told it's imminent, but not there yet. And actually, to be fair to the Minister, he and I have been talking pretty often about it. He's not holding back or anything. It's just it's yet to go through Cabinet. The agricultural sector are starting to say that they need that target. They're concerned that if a target isn't set, there will just be a lot of flip-flopping between National and Labour as governments come and go. They would like a target because then they can at least work towards it. The agricultural sector is, many of them are interested in a lower target, maybe about 14%. Realistically, the Climate Commission has said we need to reduce our methane flows by at least 35%. I would hope that we would have set a target that is at least within our legislated range of 24 to 47%. I guess other aspects of agriculture, I mean, I've talked methane, but agriculture does emit other types of climate gases as well. But for example, fuel is captured already in the ETS. We need to think about some of those other gases like nitrous oxide and think about how that should be captured in the ETS.
Right. So we also hear a lot of talk when it comes to this methane target about perhaps we will embrace something that's called no additional heating. And I hear federated farmers going on about no additional heating, and you hear this from the ACT Party and a few others around the place. Can you explain what no additional heating is for the audience, and what our scientists are saying about it when it comes to methane targets?
Yeah. So earlier this year, the government commissioned its own independent report on methane. Frankly, I mean, you do an independent report when you want a political result, and that's what they got. So they commissioned some people, and they are scientists, to come up with a review of methane. And this report more or less said that government, instead of thinking in terms of reducing methane by 24 to 47%, should think about it in terms of whether or not it added warming to the atmosphere. And so it said, no, we shouldn't think about reducing the flow overall. We should actually think about how much warming it adds. And basically, we've locked in warming already. We should think in terms of not adding to that. To me, it's a way of letting methane off the hook. I was having a really hard time getting my head around, and eventually I got the Climate Commission's one of their scientists to come in and talk me through it. And his view is that it's a nonsense, that all it does is let high methane emitters kind of grandparent their emissions and say, because we've emitted a lot in the past, we get to keep on doing it. So that's why we need to back away from that no additional warming stance.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, there's a really interesting scientific report out of Ireland recently, published, I think, in Nature Climate Change, so reputable. And Ireland is looking at this no additional warming idea as well. It's another agriculturally intensive country. And one of the arguments that the Irish people behind no additional warming present is that Ireland is a food producer. But when these scientists looked at where Ireland's food goes, it goes to rich nations. And actually, so does ours. We don't feed masses. We do feed a lot of people across the world, but the food we produce tends to go to countries that are already rich. So there's a whole equity issue sitting through there as well. Why should we rich nations not do much because we think we're supplying food to the world? So I really dislike that no additional warming argument.
Exactly. Recently, David Seymour started to campaign to his base that New Zealand should pull out of the Paris Accord. But so far, only the United States, as far as I know, have done this. And then New Zealand first started to start up with similar rhetoric shortly afterwards. But this didn't sit very well with people in our business community at all. Can you talk to us about the possible downstream economic impacts of such a move? And also, although the National Party probably wouldn't, or they'd be unlikely to agree with ACT in New Zealand First here, what does this kind of behaviour from our politicians do to our overall efforts to meet our climate commitments?
Whoa, a lot to unpack in that.
Yeah.
I was at the EDS and Sustainable Business Council climate conference recently, and one of the speakers there, Izzy Fenwick, was asked, what does it mean if we don't meet our climate targets, if we don't meet our emissions budgets and so on? And what's the impact? And she said, well, climate-wise, not much. The fact is that other countries emit a lot more emissions than us. Our own emissions are actually quite small. What we can do will make very little difference to overall global warming. But here's the problem with that. She said the problems for us are not climate. The problems for us will be, of not meeting our emissions budgets, will be economic and political. All right. the economic ones are straightforward. We have our climate goals baked into a lot of our trade agreements. So there's a straightforward trade agreement issue if we don't meet our climate goals. But more importantly than that, it's not just the fact that we've signed a trade agreement. Consumers who consume our food are starting to demand that it meets climate goals. So big supermarket chains like Sainsbury's and Tesco's are now wanting to see that the food we produce and that they sell in their supermarkets is climate sustainable food. Big producers like Nestle are making exactly the same demand, that if they buy protein from us in the form of of milk powder, that they know that it has been produced in a way that meets climate goals. So there is a trade impact for us if we do not meet our climate goals.
Yeah. There was a commentary, you mentioned that conference, there was a commentary in Newsroom recently, and oh my goodness, what did they do? They said that the politicians looked like the 2-year-olds in the room at this recent conference, and but it was because you guys were up on stage with these right-wing politicians who were talking nonsense, and then the politicians that really do want to get on with real climate action, they have to wear some of that mud. What's it like having to fight, with these other right-wing politicians who seem bent on delaying everything and letting the ETS do everything? Well, we take no action at all.
So in terms of who was on that stage, it was Stuart Smith from National and Simon Court from ACT, Mark Patterson from New Zealand First, Chloe Swarbrick from the Greens, and me from the Labour Party. And, Labour and the Greens are pretty much the same climate goals. We actually want to meet our emissions budgets. We want to do our bit. We got denialism from some of the other speakers on that stage. They couch it in various ways because you're not allowed to be a climate denier. You can't stand up there and say, I don't think climate change is true. But, for example, one member of that panel seemed to focus on the amount of gravel that was sitting in a river. It was just horrid. And then eventually, for goodness sakes, eventually one of them turned around and told me I didn't understand the climate science. I just, in fact, two of them said, more or less, Deborah, you don't know what you're talking about. And I just thought, what do I do? I'm not a scientist. I can't sit there and argue the detail of science. But frankly, they were wrong. We were arguing about the need to adapt. I said that actually we need the science. I'm really worried that this government has decimated our science capability in this country. If we're going to understand what rising sea levels mean and climate adaptation means, we need that science. We need to understand where our climate vulnerable land is. And of course, that's not just rising sea levels, it's also all the weather impacts and everything and so on. And they turned around and told me I had no idea what I was talking about. And I just, what can you say? I thought it was, I thought it was misogyny amongst other things. But it was also just, some denialism that I've heard from them previously. One of those people I heard a few nights later ask a question of an eminent climate scientist, quoting an obscure article in an obscure journal. The eminent scientist was able to point out that, in fact, it was in an obscure journal and it was written by an engineer and someone else. And frankly, it was better to rely on the stuff that was produced in journals like Nature Climate Change.
Exactly. I think it's kind of a bit of a circus, really. We watch Parliament a lot and we watch what's said out there, and we have to endure listening to Shane Jones going on and on about mining and saying, dig, baby, dig, and this entire fake news fuss that people in the National Party and people in New Zealand First and ACT are making over the 2018 ban on offshore oil and gas exploration, and how that's used as a blame game scapegoat for everything that's wrong at the moment. What do you make of all of this kind of theatrical posturing and what looks very much like an alignment with the petrochemical industrial complex?
Yeah, I find it really frustrating because they say that one of the reasons that our electricity prices have been so high is because Labor banned oil and gas exploration. It's an absolute canard. It takes 15 to 20 years to bring a new gas field online in any case. The reason that our oil and gas prices, our electricity prices have been so high is that renewable projects that have been consented have not been built by the big electricity companies, and they actually make much bigger profits when we burn coal at Huntly to produce electricity. So they've got an incentive to keep it in there. It's really frustrating because we cannot keep on burning fossil fuels. We simply must move to renewables. So I've got nothing against mining. We should be mining where there are minerals that we can use and that the world can use. But we should not be mining fossil fuels. That's a really straightforward thought. And yes, Shane Jones, it drives me crazy.
Well, you're not alone.
Yeah,
You're not alone.
he sits in question time and he says, coal, coal.
Yeah.
And you go, "Oh,
Short and reasonable, whatever it is. The coming Labor policies that you probably can't talk about too much right now, but they're going on in the background, we're pretty sure. So how are you feeling about the progress that's being made? And can you point to any top priorities that Labor might like to see addressed?
oh, we've got so many priorities that would need to be addressed. And of course, everyone has their own priorities. When we get into a government, there's a limit to what we can get done in the first 100 days. So we have to choose very carefully which things come first. We know that we will repeal the Regulatory Standards Act if it's law by then. We've committed to that. We will look at reinstating pay equity legislation. That'll take a bit of time, not because we don't want to do it, but because we actually want to make sure we do get a good system back in place. There were things that did need to be fixed about the previous system, things we could have done better, and we'll do that. We want to get fair pay agreements back in as well. I think we've committed to that. We will be announcing some policies later this year. People saying, why isn't Labor announcing its policy now? Look, there's really good politics around that. We're not just a policy machine. We actually have to do politics as well. So we need to announce them when they're ready, and announce them with an eye to the politics of it. So we have committed to releasing some policy this year, but that has to go through a process as well. The policy comes from caucus, it comes from our party members, it gets worked on by our policy council, and then it gets agreed by our New Zealand Council of the Labour Party and by caucus. And that process takes time. But we are doing it as quickly as we can.
I think you guys get singled out. There's 6 different parties in Parliament at the moment, and but the only one of them we hear about in headlines when it comes to policy and how we need to know them now, this far out from an election, is Labor. I don't know why that's the case, but we don't hear people asking for anybody else's policies. It's a bit unusual.
Well, as I've said to other people, particularly in terms of climate, we stand by what we did in our last term. We had a heap of climate policies that were in there and we're working. And if they're looking to see our climate policy, well, there is what we tried to do in the last term. And of course, we'll have a proper climate policy out in good time before the election. My hope is that I'll get it out early-ish next year, but we'll have to see how that goes. I'm not making any guarantees on that because it's a complex area. We will be talking policy this year. And I know one of the reasons, for example, that we can't put together a big fiscal plan right now and put it out there is we actually need to see the numbers that the National Party leaves us with, that will come out in the pre-election fiscal update and in the budget next year. We need to understand those before we can put a meaningful fiscal policy together ourselves. But we'll certainly have the broad outlines of that announced well before then.
Excellent. Okay, so finally, as the associate spokesperson for finance, you've seen quite a bit of Nicola Willis, and the fiscal actions of this government. These, they impact climate change, like you've covered already here, about everything that's been stripped back, the funding and everything, but they impact everything else as well, health, etc., everything. And if you were to sum it up, how would you describe the situation and her outcomes so far?
Destructive. She's been very destructive. They came into government and they stopped doing a whole lot of stuff just because Labor had done it. I think this very symbolic one around that is the ferries. They stopped that because Labor had done it, which is absolutely ridiculous. But in my speeches in the House in the last wee while, when I've been doing economic stuff, I've focused on their failure to support the construction industry. So they got in and they stopped a whole lot of construction. And we know that we've lost 19,000 jobs in construction. But to me, it's a lack of an understanding of the multiplier effect. That, if someone has a job, they spend that wage in the economy. And the money goes around and around and around. So stopping construction so quickly meant a huge dampening effect on our economy. And that effect has been shown so clearly in yesterday's GDP figures, down 0.9% in a quarter. And I think the economy has shrunk by something like 3.2%, I think is the figure, since they came into office. That's so irresponsible. And standard Keynesian economic theory would say that when an economy is under pressure, when it's shrinking, government's job is to step in and to prop it up. And straightforwardly, I would be doing it by building infrastructure. I think there's one road in this country which I think we desperately need, and that's a decent road over the Brynderwyns so that we can support Northland a bit better. But there's other infrastructure that we should be in there and building, like more social housing. And that would, borrowing to spend on long-term infrastructure is not a problem. What we need to do is borrow it, spread the cost over several generations, which is exactly what you do by borrowing, and use that to ensure that jobs stay in the economy, and that so people feel confident about spending a little, about going and buying that restaurant meal, keeping our local hospitality industry going. They feel confident about buying some clothes. They might buy an appliance. They might pay for their kids to go on a trip somewhere, all the sorts of things that keep our economy ticking over. And that's not happening because, frankly, Nicola Willis has just taken a sledgehammer to the economy.
Yeah, it's shocking. Everyone is shocked out of their brains at the moment. Everyone agrees with you. It's destructive, all right. Deborah, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today under very difficult circumstances when you're not well, but you've done a fabulous job and you've really knocked it out of the park for everybody. Thank you so much, and we'd love to have you come back on and talk to us all again soon.
Thank you. Perhaps after we've announced our tax policy.
I look forward to it. See you again.
Ka kite anō.
Welcome to G News, the good news.